So welcome everyone to Landmark Chambers, the Future of the Environment Act 2021 seminar. And we're delighted to see so many of you joining the session today. And I hope that you will find the presentations and the discussion that we'll have after them to be useful and informative. My name's Sasha Blackmore and I'm chairing the session today, joined by my colleagues Alex Goodman, KC, and guest speakers Ruth Chambers, OBE, and Jolyon Maugham, KC, whom I'll formally introduce just before they give their presentations. So if we can begin. If I can ask Alex.
Ruth first.
Ruth.
Hi everyone, and hello people joining online.
So if I could just introduce Ruth for those of you who don't know her. Ruth Chambers OBE is the Senior Fellow at the environmental think tank Green Alliance. She's been working on the Environment Act since 2017, for which she deserves the thanks of all the environmental lawyers gathered here today and online. She also serves as an honorary professor of practice at the UCL Centre for Law and the Environment and is an advisor to River Action UK and the RSPB. And her contributions to environmental policy and advocacy were recognised in 2022 when she was awarded an OBE for services to the environment. Ruth.
Thanks so much for the introduction. I'll try not to mess up the slides, so let me get them working. Right. So the future of the Environment Act, you think, gosh, why are we talking about that? It's 2021, it's 3 or 4 years old nearly. Well, in order to fuel that conversation, we first need to look backwards and look at and understand where it came from. So that's what I'm going to do for a few slides. And it came from 2 places, really. And the first is what we call the Brexit governance gap. And the environmental coalition that Green Alliance helped forge, called Green UK, identified that gap back in 2017. And that's really the gap in accountability and enforcement that would exist once the UK left the EU. And we published this briefing, which became a seminal kind of standpoint for us as we then judged whether or not that gap was closing. But secondly, the government, once it was persuaded that there was a gap, saw it as an opportunity to announce what it termed at the time as a green Brexit. And the then Environment Secretary gave a sort of a landmark speech in November 2017 that answered the questions that we'd been asking, which is that the government was indeed going to close this gap by establishing a new governance body. And as I'll explain, that became the Office for Environmental Protection. So that's where the Act actually began back in 2017. What happened next was there needed to be legislation to put in place various things that the UK needed after Brexit. And we thought at the time that this was going to be the only Brexit bill. Little did we know, nobody really understood the processes that would be needed. So the EU Withdrawal Act started to pass through Parliament. It didn't have any sector-specific provisions in it. It was really about the framework of the UK's departure. But by now, the government hadn't acted on that promise that Mr. Gove gave. There was no sort of consultation, and parliamentarians and civil society campaigners were starting to become concerned about that. So we worked together, and in the end, we persuaded, after quite a sort of intense passage, we persuaded the government to insert this section into the EU Withdrawal Act. And as you can see, it commits the Secretary of State to do what government really doesn't ever like to do, which is to publish draft legislation within a specific timescale. And that legislation was formed in 2 parts. One was about environmental principles, and one was about this new governance body. So we felt that that was really a significant milestone. However, if the government was going to legislate on the environment, then this seemed too good an opportunity to miss. And rather than just close the Brexit governance gap, there was a lot of other really important environmental measures that needed to have some legal foundation. So a wider campaign began, and actually the Prime Minister of the time, Theresa May, announced via a tweet that the government would indeed do a wider Environment Act. In fact, it was the days before we were religiously watching over social media, and most of the environment sector missed this announcement because it wasn't on gov.uk, it was just in a tweet, but it was really significant and very welcome. And why this really mattered is Theresa May herself was the Prime Minister that brought a long-term plan for the environment called the 25-year plan for the environment into being. And she herself recognised the need for that to have a statutory footing and for that to be wrapped up in a wider legislation. So then just before the deadline, the government published the draft bill that the EU Withdrawal Act committed it to. The draft Environmental Principles and Governance Bill is still available online. It's definitely worth having a look at if you're interested in the origins of where different provisions came from. And it did 5 also really important things. It sought to embed the former EU environmental principles into our domestic system. It's going to set up this new governance body, the Office for Environmental Protection. It was going to put in place the 25-year plan on a statutory footing, and it would become known as the Environmental Improvement Plan. It only covered England, which was quite an important issue, and climate law was excluded. So already we had another governance gap emerging because the Climate Change Committee, it scrutinises and it advises government, but it doesn't have an enforcement role. So that was mainly the shape of that draft bill. On the environmental principles duty, I think this is relevant for what the later speakers will talk about. There was a big debate about the standard of the duty. Should it be have regard, due regard, special regard, apply, act in accordance with? There was a real menu of different options and different views as to which one was better and which one was stronger. In the draft bill, the government went for have regard. Meanwhile, people like Green Alliance pointed to what parliamentarians said about have regard duties, that the most famous kind of environmental have regard duty was one in the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, where public authorities had to have regard to biodiversity. And when the post-legislative scrutiny of that act took place, peers found that that duty was ineffective and unenforceable. I didn't like have regard wording. The next question was which principles, and in the draft bill, I mean, this may surprise some of you, but it was a really long list, surprised us actually. So it had the 5 core EU principles, had the principle of sustainable development that snuck in, but then it had the Aarhus rights as well. So it was a longer list than we were expecting. From the principles duty, there were sweeping exclusions. Some of those exclusions worked their way through into the final Environment Act. But there was one in section C, which I've put on the screen, which is that the government could exclude any matter specified in regulations if the Secretary of State felt that that was the right course. So pretty wide exclusions. Fortunately, for draft bills, they undergo a really important process known as pre-legislative scrutiny. It's one reason why I think the government rarely publishes draft bills, because it allows for extra parliamentary attention. And the PLS for the Environment Principles and Governance Bill was really significant because it's where the big changes were made. The bill was amended as it passed through Parliament as well, but the PLS, which was undertaken by 2 House of Commons committees, the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Committee and the Environmental Audit Committee, resulted in some quite major developments. One, for the new oversight body, the OEP, its independence was strengthened. There was a new duty placed on the Secretary of State. This is really important as the OEP was given a principal objective. So their set out in law would be its purpose, if you like. So governments in the future, unless they wanted to change the law, couldn't say, well, I'm sorry, I thought the OEP was meant to do this or that. This wasn't in the bill, but it was nevertheless made as a commitment in response to the PLS reports. And the OEP was to have a 5-year indicative budget ring-fenced in any spending review. So to give it financial security and to mean that it wouldn't be at the whims of future ministers. One of the things we're asking the new government is to repeat that commitment for the upcoming spending review. Also, the government listened to the committees and it decided that this body, the OEP, should have bespoke enforcement powers with provision for a new system called environmental review, and that would be heard in the upper tribunal. So remember, the upper tribunal, I'll come back to that in a minute. And then finally, and this was very significant, the government listened and the OEP's remit would also include climate law as well as environmental law. So a lot of changes, more than perhaps we could have imagined. And on environmental principles, then the government decided, yes, it would be strengthened to due regard, and that worked its way through to the final act. It also listened to what, on the face of it, might have seemed perverse arguments from environmental campaigners to take the Aarhus rights out from that list. And the reason for that, you can read it later perhaps in the extract from the Select Committee reports, is that this was a fairly weak framework and that rights would be better off served outside the framework, which is really a policy framework. So the government listened on that. And then finally, the worst carve out, so that you can basically exclude anything you like, ministers, that was also taken out as well. So then the Environment Bill started its passage. So for most bills, we don't get that luxury of pre-legislative scrutiny. It eventually got royal assent in November 2021. We could spend the rest of the week talking about the passage because it was so long, 1,000 days between the publication of the bill and royal assent, of over 600 days since the bill was first introduced to Parliament for all sorts of reasons. It was in 3 Queen's speeches, carried over between different sessions, delayed by the pandemic. Half of the House of Lords stages ended up being either online or in hybrid format, which was a challenge for everyone. And the blog that I've put a link to gives you a little bit more detail about that sort of long passage. And it took a lot of energy and a lot of stamina from parliamentarians, from government, and from the environment sector. So just a few highlights, which I think are relevant to this evening's conversation. One is, that despite the longevity of the passage, the debate was fierce and incessant, and it never stopped until the last minute of the debate. And parliamentarians really wanted this system to work. They wanted it to be as robust and as independent as possible. And they kept insisting at every point that either the bill be amended or the government make statements or there be some other clarity on that. And I think that consensus, despite the election, despite the changed makeup of Parliament, it's still there today, which is encouraging. However, when the bill was sitting waiting to come back when Parliament was closed down because of the pandemic, the then DEFRA Secretary of State, unfortunately, did take the opportunity to change some of the ways in which the enforcement system would work. So the forum was changed from the upper tribunal to the High Court. Sure, we could debate whether that's good or not so good. I think we'd been looking forward to the more deliberative opportunities that perhaps the upper tribunal would have offered. And then this was very controversial, and the Secretary of State gave himself or herself a power to basically tell this watchdog, this independent body, how it should undertake its enforcement activity. And I've included the actual provision below. That guidance hasn't been issued, and the government of the day made various commitments as to when and the circumstances under which it would be issued. But it is there still on the statute book, and it makes us feel uncomfortable. And then finally, another really major development that happened in passage is that Northern Ireland was included so that the OEP has a bi-jurisdictional remit. And that's so significant because Northern Ireland doesn't have an independent environmental protection agency. It's got a history of regulatory dysfunction. So suddenly the OEP covering Northern Ireland, it seemed a potential game changer. So what the Environment Act does for environmental governance, going back to that governance gap, which was our main interest really all along, is it put in place 4 cornerstones. 3 of those apply in Northern Ireland. And environmental principles, duty and policy statements, and ministers of the Crown have to have due regard, as the government changed it to not the environmental principles directly, but a policy statement on them. We are working through at the moment how that is working. The duty itself has only been live for about a year and a couple of months. And I think it's fair to say it's not yet reaching all parts of government. Second cornerstone is the Office for Environmental Protection itself, an advisory, scrutiny and enforcement body. The third is the Environmental Improvement Plan, so that 25-year plan, which is now on a statutory footing. And the new government, one of the first things it did when it got elected is it recognised that the existing plan could be improved and needed to be strengthened, with delivery potential made much clearer. And that's the exercise it's undergoing at the moment. And then those wider provisions in order to set targets in 4 priority areas of air, water, nature and waste. And there's a duty on the government to have done that by 31st of October 2022. It missed that deadline, but it did it shortly afterwards. Headline targets on species abundance and particulate matter, which now exist in law. They're not as strong as perhaps we would have wanted, but they are there and they are driving government action. And then a broad target setting power, which can be accessed at any time. And it is really very broad. So if the government decides that new targets are needed on access to nature or chemical pollution, or indeed any other matter relating to the environment, it can reach for that power and it can set those targets in the future. The Environment Act, though, was also very, very broad and excuse me. So it's got a lot of other provisions as well as that governance framework. And I won't go through these in detail at all, but there are chapters on air quality. This is the act that put in place biodiversity net gain, which many of you will be familiar with, and established local nature recovery strategies, updated conservation covenants, brought forward at the time what was described as a world-leading measure on forest risk commodities. There's one snag with that. It's yet to go live more than 3 years later. Again, something we're pressing government on. Government's got powers to amend chemicals regulations. There's a big chapter on resources and waste. This is the Act of Parliament that allows the deposit return scheme, for example, to be set up. And then a big chapter on water quality. And I think the debates in Parliament, especially in the House of Lords on water quality, were really the start of the public discourse that we see today on water pollution. When Philip Dunn, the former member of Parliament and chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, tried to get his private member's bill inserted into this act, and the Duke of Wellington and others in the House of Lords campaigned. They strengthened the Environment Act, but it wasn't good enough, and hence the new government launching different regulatory reviews. So finally then, 3 years on, what's the verdict? We've looked back over the history and the origins of this act. We've just published a new report to mark 5 years of Brexit. It looks at the Environment Act, but it also looks at the environmental governance systems across the UK. And just one word on Wales. I know we're not talking about that tonight, but there is no equivalent to the Environment Act and this environmental governance system in Wales yet. We hope very much that a bill appears in the Senedd in June, and then that will pass before the elections in 2026. So what we do know is that this system, it is being used. It may be imperfect in some regards, but it is prompting rethinks. We also can see that the OEP is starting to hit its stride. It's not yet tested the full extent of its legal powers, but it's starting to become an authority in the eyes before the court. It's intervened in, I think, 3 cases, one of which was the Finch case, where the judges found its submissions particularly helpful in their words. So that's encouraging. However, much else in the Act has been hit by delay. So I've mentioned the deforestation measure, which at the moment is very much stuck in the long grass. The deposit return scheme, recently the government has introduced regulations which Parliament passed to set that up, but by the time that gets going, it will be 9 years after that deposit return scheme was first mentioned. And then Section 21, have a look at this later. It's the only part of the governance system that's yet to go live, and it requires ministers to publish a report that enables them to look outside UK borders at international environmental protection developments. That report is late and overdue. So I've mentioned more work is needed across the UK. In Northern Ireland, there's a review live at the moment of environmental governance, including whether or not there should be an independent environmental protection agency to join the OEP. And in Scotland, we wait with bated breath for a new bill on the natural environment, which hopefully will include target setting provisions. And all of this, the place to bring it together, and discussions tonight and afterwards, will be in 2026. The Environment Act will have what we call post-legislative scrutiny, a good chance to look at opportunities to improve its implementation. There are some glitches in how it works, and maybe even to expand its provisions. Thanks very much.
Before we move on to our next speaker, does anyone have any questions? No open questions online? I have a question to ask, but perhaps think about for after Alex has spoken as well, which is when you talked about the menu of different options, which option would you now wish was in there? Why? But perhaps best addressed after.
You mean for the strength of the duty?
Yes, in due regard, and you talked about there being a range of different options, and also because, you know, one may get other future opportunities when other wording is considered in acts, and so you may have views that can usefully be discussed. Any other questions? No.
Good evening to the room, good evening online, cameras over there. And thank you to Landmark for hosting this evening. My dad used to deal in stamps, which was probably didn't know much about stamps. But he was quite relaxed about this. He thought that the person with the most knowledge should make the most profit, and he didn't much mind that the person with the least knowledge made the least profit. And I've sort of taken that as a guide for this evening. The person with the least knowledge in the room, certainly amongst the panel, is me. And so I will speak for the shortest period of time. On the screen are some slides on amendments proposed to the Act. And those amendments, I don't encourage you to sort of read them in detail on the screen, are also in printouts by the coat stand at the back of the room, and I can supply them through Landmark to those online. They were developed following a grant by the Aurora Trust, which is one of the Sainsbury trusts, following a conversation that I had with Aurora about some amendments that I'm going to talk about now. They came about really because it seemed to us as though the process through which international human rights norms were introduced to the UK might provide a good analogue, a kind of magnetic north, for how we might more radically approach the role of the law in embedding environmental practice throughout government and the judiciary. And I guess I was interested sort of at two levels, really. First of all, as an environmentalist, you know, tackling environmental breakdown, it can't be a thing that you do at the end. It can't be a thing that you do as well. It's not like, you know, you organize a conference and then you check that you haven't got a manel. You know, it needs to be much more central to how the various institutions of the state approach the importance of climate breakdown, and the duties in the Human Rights Act have successfully embedded human rights and thinking about human rights into both executive action and also into judicial interpretation. And as a lawyer as well as an environmentalist, the mechanics that the Human Rights Act adopts for incorporating a kind of corpus of international law into domestic law in a dualist legal system. So if anyone in the room doesn't know, some legal systems give effect automatically in domestic law to international treaty obligations, and some don't. And we're a don't legal system. What the Human Rights Act does is it takes this corpus of rights in the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms and it, through a series of interfaces, if you like, gives them effect in our national courts and obliges executive functions, the exercise of executive functions, to place those human rights obligations sort of foremost in their minds. So there's an obligation to take human rights into account if you're a judge when you're interpreting a provision that might be about planning obligations. You're not allowed to say, well, this is about planning obligations, it's not about human rights, so I can just ignore human rights. It requires public authorities always to act consistently with that corpus of human rights. So it has the consequence that, like judges, public authorities always have to be thinking about human rights obligations when they exercise their executive functions. And of course, there's a power in the Human Rights Act as well for a court to declare a piece of statute law, primary legislation, incompatible with the Human Rights Act. They can't strike it down, the judges, but they can declare it incompatible. And the consequence of that is that even Parliament has to think about human rights obligations when it's legislating. And, you know, if you're really serious about climate breakdown, also it seemed to me, and I persuaded Aurora, that's how you have to think about how the state approaches the business of stemming the climate breakdown. So we pitched that and they funded it. And then we got a bit stuck. We got stuck on the fact that, unlike with the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, for environmental law, there isn't a single corpus of environmental obligations anywhere in international law. There's no single treaty that captures all of the environmental obligations that you might want a state to be subject to, as there is, as I say, with the ECHR. And also, and so you then think, well, maybe we should just cherry pick the ones that we like from the various treaties that do exist. And if you did that, you would come up with a pretty good body of law. But the problem with that approach is very much that it tends to frighten the horses. Right, so if you're thinking about what a piece of legislative change looks like, you're having regard to two things. You're having regard to whether it will actually achieve the change that you want it to achieve. Will it be consequential? But you're also having regard to the need not to frighten the horses, right? You don't want to terrify parliamentarians into thinking that the legislation that you're encouraging them to contemplate is going to upend everything. You know, you don't want to frighten the horses, but really, if they understood, they'd be terrified, if I can push the metaphor. And I guess we then eventually realised that Parliament had already done this job. The Environment Act had already identified a succession of principles drawn from international law that captured some very important ideas about how the judiciary, how the executive, how business ought to approach the job of environmental protection. Those principles are all drawn from international law, and they're in section 17 of the Act. So there's 5. The principle of environmental protection should be integrated into the making of policies. There should be preventative action to avert environmental damage. There's the precautionary principle. We can all immediately see what that means. The principle that environmental damage should be rectified at source, and the polluter pays principle. So taken together, if those principles operated as the European Convention on Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms operates, they would be profoundly important to what government does. All emanations of the state do indeed, and also to how judges weighed up the competing arguments before them. In all sorts of cases, they'd be bound to have regard to those principles. But the problem is that the due regard duty, and indeed the way in which it's constructed, the various carve-outs to it, are really quite weak. So in section 19, the duty requires a minister, when making policy, to have due regard to the policy statement on environmental principles. There are various caveats and cutouts to that duty, but it only applies to ministers in formulating policy, not in exercising any other function. And it's only a duty to have regard to a policy statement that they themselves produce, as opposed to a broader duty applying to all relevant functions and all public authorities. So we worked with a very senior drafter, ex of what was the Department for the Environment, to produce these amendments, and they do affect quite a significant behavioural change. They don't go as far as the obligation in Section 6 of the Human Rights Act, where it's unlawful to act in a way that's incompatible with those human rights in the schedule to the Human Rights Act. And the reason for that really is because the environmental principles are quite, they lack an element of legal certainty. So they express ideas about how things should be done, but they're not the sorts of precise obligations rendered more precise by decades of jurisprudence in Strasbourg, as you find in the Human Rights Act. But they're sort of more akin, I suppose, to the public sector equality duty. They would oblige all public authorities, as a matter of law, really to apply their minds to the environmental principles when doing everything that they do. So they do mark a kind of, we think, quite significant extension to the present environmental principles and the obligations that attach to them. And there's also in those amendments a provision around the interpretation of legislation. It requires, whenever it's possible to do so, judges to read legislative provisions in a way that's compatible with the environmental principles, and it applies to all courts and tribunals. You know, the art of proposing this stuff, I think, and sometimes you're working hand in hand with ministers who want this stuff on the statute books but have opponents in cabinet who don't, is to give them stuff that they can sell internally, and that requires that you do things quietly, even if it is your hope, indeed, even if it's your expectation, that they will have quite consequential legal effects. And I suppose we're now waiting for the Labour Party to decide where it is in relation to environmental protection. It is, Ruth and I were chatting before the event, it is panicking really quite early in its term. So now's not the time to seek to persuade it to do anything at all, really. But we do think these are a very important way of restoring, as is necessary, we believe, environmentalism to the heart of all executive decision making, without which I think we are in serious trouble. Anyway, enough from me.
We have one question that's come through online. Would there be benefit in adding reference to the Aarhus into the new 19A, given what Ruth said about it not being reflected in the environmental principles, and why?
So I think the Green Alliance has prepared, with David Wolf, King Council's help, proposal that does something very similar to that, but it might be better for Ruth, for you to talk about that.
I think with the framework remaining as it is, the Aarhus rights are best kept away from it. If it was a stronger framework, then we could have that conversation. I think it would diminish the force of those rights if it were put into the environmental principles framework.
As it presently stands.
Yeah.
Just one other question. Very interesting seeing your draft section 19A. It seemed to me, just looking at it briefly and also having thought about the acts as it exists, that given the nature of environmental principles and what you were saying about the way they work and perhaps how they're not quite fit for the purpose of being another version of the human rights principles that we're familiar with, the policy statement in the end comes down, is a very important part of the whole process, because it's the policy statement that will set out in more concrete ways what they're going to mean. Have you given any thought to other amendments that there might be to the process for producing policy statements? I mean, the climate change regime has its critics, but one of the successes, I think, in that is that you have the committee sitting independently and feeding into government and having a discussion. Is there any scope for something similar around policy statements on environmental principles?
I remember sitting in the Oxford Union with a Chinese student who was talking about what was happening in China on environmental policy. And as I chatted to him, I thought, goodness me, nice to live in a state where you don't need to be bound in your policy making to 5-year electoral cycles. I guess the point that I'm making really is this, that we drafted the measures that we drafted in such a way as to remove, somewhat at least from ministers, the temptation to sacrifice the long term for short-term political expediency. We're already struggling. Well, certainly I'm already struggling. I mustn't speak for anyone else in the room, with the gap between what this government is saying, what this government has said, and what this government is doing. I mean, it's not always a gap that is, as indeed Ruth was saying to me earlier, that's a negative gap. Sometimes what they're doing is more beneficial than what they're saying. I mean, but I do think this is a long It's a problem we have to solve over time. Removing its solution from here today, gone tomorrow, ministers and their political pressures probably is the answer.
Shall I crack on?
Yeah.
All right, so we've heard from two perspectives of the build up to the Act and where it could in principle go next. I'm going to do the more conventional role of just explaining what the actual provisions of the Act or Section 19 says and look at one of the cases that's been about it. So I'm focusing on Section 19. So Section 19 is this new duty that we've referred to in both of the other talks already, that a Minister of the Crown must, when making policy, have due regard to the policy statement on environmental principles currently in effect. The explanatory notes say that the Act legislates for environmental principles to protect and enhance the environment by making environmental considerations central to the policy development process across government. The principles work together to legally oblige ministers of the Crown to ensure nature and the environment are proactively considered in the policy making process. And just to give you the full legislation around this section, Section 17 is the other key provision. The Secretary of State must prepare a policy statement on environmental principles. So that's what I'm going to call the EPPS, the Environmental Principles Policy Statement. And paragraph 5 of Section 17, in this part, environmental principles means the following principles. And we've got there the integration principle, the preventative principle, the precautionary principle, the rectification principle, and the polluter pays principle. So we heard from Ruth about how the intention behind this Act was to fill a gap after Brexit. Now, all of these are principles that feature very strongly across EU environmental law. So, for example, Articles 11 and 191 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. Article 11 is concerned with the integration principle, and Article 191 with the precautionary principle. Having exited that treaty, we've now got the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and Article 393 seeks to ensure these principles are continued, all 5 of them. It says that the principles are, in fact, it refers to the Rio Declaration of 1992 and provides that each party commits to respecting the internationally recognised environmental principles to which it has committed, and the parties reaffirm their respective commitments to procedures for evaluating the likely impact of a proposed activity on the environment. So the Section 19 duty, Section 17 to 19, are in some respects giving effect to that commitment in the treaty. This is a quick summary of what the statement says. It's quite a long document, the Environmental Principles Policy Statement, but it was published in January and then came into effect in November 23. Policy making. The legal duty to have due regard to the policy statement applies to ministers when making policy. And it also provides the Environment Act requires ministers of the Crown to have due regard to this policy statement when making policy. The duty to have due regard is commonly used in legislation. This will ensure an effective and consistent application, which is not just a tick box exercise. The background to this is a concern to ensure that across Whitehall, ministerial policy would continue to reflect the each of the 5 environmental principles. And when you look at some of the materials around the enactment of this, it's clear that there was quite a sincere intention to integrate the principles into decision making in Whitehall. But there's been quite a struggle to understand exactly what this Section 19 duty might in fact require. So I just want to give some of the kind of environmental down here. This is the latest Climate Change Committee Progress Report. Now, obviously, the Environment Act isn't about climate change, but it's just an indication of one of the many challenges that are faced. The net zero targets have tightened considerably. The Climate Change Committee says we're not on track, and in fact, in 6 years, we've got to get to 68%. Well, we're at 50 at the moment, so we've cut predominantly through the ending of coal-fired power. and the next 18% is where it starts to get hard. We've done the low-hanging fruit, and we've got the difficult bit to come. So how one wonders, are we going to go about that? Is it all just going to be about measures related to power, or are we going to start to see net zero permeate through lots of forms of government policy? Well, one of the things that has accompanied government net zero policy, which we see through section 1 of the Climate Change Act, the amendment that brought in the 100% target by 2050, is that local authorities also took up a lot of climate emergency declarations. And local authorities are looking at ways, how can we align with the net zero targets? And a lot of local authorities have then sought to implement policies which aim towards net zero in their development plans. So they've started to bring policies in that say, when you build new buildings in our area, you've got to aim towards net zero, or you've got to meet net zero energy thresholds. In other words, your buildings have to be highly energy efficient. And that's what's now become the subject of all this litigation that I'm about to explain to you. The first case concerned this written ministerial statement. The case is called Rights Community Action, and it's focused around West Oxfordshire District Council. They want to build a garden village, and in the garden village, every house is required to meet a net zero threshold. So it's going to be a net zero development. But the landowner, Grosvenor, wasn't very happy about that requirement and challenged it and said it was inconsistent with government policy. The examining inspectors agreed and said that the policy was unsound. So that would, in effect, prevent the local planning authority from adopting this area action plan. Rights Community Action judicially reviewed the decision of the inspectors. The basis of the claim was this written ministerial statement. And this goes back to 2015, so this was the very end of the coalition government, Eric Pickles. And he explained in this statement that the government's expectation was they were going to bring in new energy standards in 2016. In fact, these never eventuated. But in the meantime, we see the injunction to local planning authorities was that they could continue to set and apply policies in their local plans which require compliance with energy performance standards that exceed the energy requirements of the building regulations. So it seemed like that might support the idea, but the inspectors disagreed. And in their report, they found that the net zero carbon development policy wasn't consistent with national policy, found it unsound. This was challenged in the High Court in front of Mrs. Justice Leven, and Mrs. Justice Leven agreed with the claimant, Rights Community Action, that their interpretation of the written ministerial statement was wrong. The key bits emboldened there. In order to make sense of the written ministerial statement in the circumstances that apply in 2023, it's essential to have regard to the fact that the restriction on setting conditions above code level 4, upon which the inspector relied, no longer apply. To interpret the WMS so as to prevent or restrict the ability of the LPAs to set a standard higher than level 4 is plainly wrong in the light of subsequent events. So the outcome of this was that, as many local authorities had done across the country, Bath, Cornwall, various councils had already adopted policies that aimed for energy efficiency standards well above building regulation minima. Court was saying that's fine, that's consistent with government policy. So just to sort of think about the impact of that, this government now is committed to 1.5 million new houses across Britain. If each of them only comply with the building regulation minima, they're not meeting a net zero threshold. So what you're doing is layering in more development that will have more greenhouse gas emissions. So as you try and reduce the overall greenhouse gas emission content to zero by 2050, you're going to have to counteract the additional emissions that you've built into the system, the extra 1.5 million homes. And in other words, you're going to have to somehow deal with a problem that you're creating for yourself. In other words, you're building more emissions into the system at the same time as trying to cut them. And in reality, as soon as you build these houses, you're going to have to start retrofitting them to get them to net zero standard. And so a lot of local authorities are saying, well, why go through that? Let's just build them standard now. And it seemed as though after this judgment, that was on the cards, but the government's response, which I'm afraid is working very slowly, if you want to press it. That's 3 times. Was to pass a new written ministerial statement that counteracted the effect of Mrs Justice Leaven's judgment. And this was on the 13th of December 23, and it said the government does not expect plan makers to set local energy efficiency standards for buildings that go beyond current or planned building regulations. If they do, they should be rejected at examination. So central government policy is now that you can't set policies in your development plan that seek to extend the building regulations minimum. And so in effect, there's one threshold for everybody, and that's the building regulations. So this is the subject now of the second claim for judicial review. The first claim was dismissed again by the second claim was dismissed in the High Court by Mrs Justice Leaven, but is now going to an appeal probably in May in the Court of Appeal. And the challenge was that this new policy around energy efficiency wasn't subject to the Section 19 due regard duty. You'll recall the duty came in November 23. This written ministerial statement was promulgated in December, and unsurprisingly, they overlooked elements of it. And the Secretary of State, in fact, accepted that in making the new written ministerial statement, the minister had not had sight of the EPPS assessment. So someone in Whitehall had done something, but they hadn't in fact put it in front of the minister's nose. And however, the judge said that the failure to comply with that duty didn't mean that the policy needed to be revisited. And that was because after the judicial review was issued, the government then did make sure that they went through the motions and produced an after the event retrospective assessment of the policy. She made some observations about the nature of the duty, including that it's a diffuse one, whose objectives are not clear cut. And she said there's nothing unlawful in prioritising economic growth over negative environmental impacts. So that was her judgment, and there's now an appeal. And it's become quite a big appeal because we've got 2, potentially 3 interveners. We've got the Office of Environmental Protection intervening. I'm instructed now, it was good law practice, we're now with Lee Day for Rights Community Action. Alex Shattuck is acting with me. Office of Environmental Protection's intervened, Green Alliance has intervened, and there's a consortium of local authorities who are applying to intervene. And the argument is that, first of all, the statutory language is the duty applies when making policy. So first of all, well, that's very different, for example, to the PSCD, the Public Sector Quality Duty. That language must mean something. And the ordinary interpretation of when making is that you apply it when making the policy, not retrospectively after judicial review.
You make it sound so easy, Alan.
The OEP's point is that the EPPS itself reinforces that interpretation. So the policy statement reinforces the statutory language of when making and says assess the impacts early and in an iterative way. So again, inconsistent with doing it as a rearguard process. And the OEP argues the level of inquiry needed is much more intense than the public sector equality duty. So you have this active duty finding out what the impacts are. So in the context of the written ministerial statement, you can see this context of potentially impacting on 1.5 million homes is quite a significant one. If you were to look at the detail of this, you'd have to make your own mind up whether you thought in consequence was sufficient. The Green Alliance intervention stresses that while the duty is one of process, it's tied to the achievement of more substantive outcomes. For example, Section 17(4) provides the Secretary of State must be satisfied that the EPPS will, when it comes into effect, contribute to the improvement of environmental protection. So everyone accepts it's predominantly a process duty, this, but it has a substantive outcome focus on it. So way forward to a hearing. We haven't got a listing yet, but there were some inquiries about May. I think most people seeing this would be inclined to think that what Mrs Justice Leaven has said is quite consistent with the latter end of public sector equality duty case law. It's rare now that you'd bring a challenge that there'd been a failure to comply with the duty to have due regard to equalities issues and think that you'd get very far beyond the defendant producing something that complied with it, and then a defence on Section 31 grounds, or the court saying, well, it's all water under the bridge now. So, but looking back at when the PSCD started, it was a very significant new provision. If you look back at cases, even before the Equality Act, there were predecessors of it. And there were lots of cases where the court said Parliament must have intended to do something when they were passing this measure beyond impose more bureaucratic hurdles on local authorities and other public authorities. So it may be that the Court of Appeal, which takes a slightly loftier approach, a loftier view, and isn't quite so inundated with the day-to-day claims before it, decides this was a sincere attempt to integrate environmental principles into decision-making, and that this duty needs to be given some meaning beyond requiring central government to produce retrospective assessments when challenged by judicial review. But we'll have to see whether they are bold enough to go that far. So that's the outline of the litigation, and that's all I have to say on it for now. But we've got a little bit more time for questions before we have a drink. Any more questions?
Should we give you a round of applause?
In the world of planning, I read the NDPF and the recent reforms as a move towards house building in a way that kind of increases the threshold, which other considerations can trump the need for housing, and that would include environmental consideration. My reading of it is that London Plan, for example, environmental protections in the London Plan are almost sort of weakened in comparison to the need for housing. So how do you, if you agree with that view, how do you reconcile that with this Section 19 duty?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's certainly a fair characterisation. The government is definitely tilting policy towards house building and trying to make a number of legislative and policy changes to achieve that. But the instant government policy can't change the meaning of a statutory measure passed by Parliament. So, in a sense, it can't possibly impact on the proper interpretation of the statute or of the environmental principles policy statement as passed when they came into effect. So I wouldn't be concerned about as a matter of principle, the current policy inclinations of a government can't influence the legislative meaning.
Can I go back to the question that I was asking in terms of when you talked about the menu of different options and where we're looking at sort of at the end of the PSCD case law and what to give due regard means. If you were putting that to one side and choosing different phraseology now, what would you look at choosing?
I mean, we considered this extensively when the environment bill was being debated, and we had, I guess, 5 things that we wanted the duty to do, or rather the system to do, which we couldn't quite get there. But I think should we have another opportunity, we'd want to revisit each of those. One is the question you've just asked, which is the standard of the duty, and I think our preference was always to apply, so to require ministers to apply the environmental principles. It was the closest that we could envisage to the duty that as it existed in the EU form. So I think we'd return to that. The second part would be that the duty should apply to the principles themselves and not to the policy statement. So more direct application and link. The third would be to make sure that it was extended beyond policy making to cover all relevant functions. Policy making is great, that includes making legislation, but other functions are perhaps absent. The carve-outs that were mentioned, I mean, they are quite extensive in relation to policy making on the spending of allocation resources, taxation, defence and national security. They don't exist at an EU level. It's not clear why they need to exist in our system. And then the fifth would be it applies to government ministers of the Crown, but not to public authorities. apart from that, when those authorities are making policy on behalf of ministers, and there are examples of that, but it's very unclear as to who those public authorities are and which of their policy making functions are in scope. So you don't need to change the legislation to clarify that, but it does need some clarity.
I was smiling, Ruth, as I listened to you. The joke at my own expense I often make is that my tombstone will reveal, will record. He reinvented many wheels.
I've got a question about section 102 of the Act, which is the biodiversity duty as changed and enshrined within the 21 Act. My reading of it, even though it's presented as characterised as a strengthening of the biodiversity duty, I actually read it as having the opposite effect, because it seems to turn the biodiversity duty from a requirement to have regard in the exercise of all functions and all decision making into a reporting duty, a kind of retrospective duty that every few years the government and the minister has to report on progress towards the environmental duty, the biodiversity duty, rather than having that embedded into every single facet of decision making. Am I right to read it that way?
I can't remember it off the top of my head. I'm gonna have to look it up. So ask another question and I'll have a look at it.
I mean, I don't think you're wrong, put it that way, and that the duty is it's still evolving, and it's relatively new. I think the observations I might make on it, it's a duty on public authorities, including local authorities. The extent to which they're able to grip such a duty in the current fiscal climate and in a world where local government reorganisation is very much on the horizon, I think is a question that we should be asking almost regardless of what that sort of duty says. The other is that the Office for Environmental Protection does an annual assessment of government progress on the environment, and for the past 2 years it's found that progress is significantly off track, including on nature recovery. I'm sure you know this. Things are not getting better, and in the last year things actually got a little bit worse. Now the government is reviewing that environmental improvement plan. The apex goal of that plan is thriving plants and wildlife. So I think if we feel that the duty is not driving the delivery of that goal, then I think it needs to be re-examined.
Just talking a lot about this have regard duty. And in fact, I think Alex, you're looking up the section 102, but I see there's a must in there, which is nice to see. And we just had a dispute involving the Crow Act, which has been changed in the 2023 Levelling Up Regeneration Act from a must, from a shall have regard to the purpose of the provisions of it, to a must seek to further the purpose of it. Anyway, we sued the government the other day over this issue, and they caved in on last week. So I think it's a provision with teeth. It should be, and I hope it, and it's much better, these must provisions, than these regard or even due regard duties. So I think that if in policy or whatever it is terms, I think if one can try and get the likes of yourself, Ruth, to change the law to from a regard to a must, that would be a good thing.
And there's a question for me in relation to what you just said about consistency, like in the example that you're describing. Why is that duty formulated in that better, stronger way? Whereas why are some of the other duties used, using kind of lower standards? It's not really clear. Whereas the outcomes that they're seeking to achieve are generally very similar in environmental terms.
Yeah. I don't know if there's another one sitting inside the Levelling Up Act about heritage, where I think it has similar wording, but not yet in force, and perhaps they're nervous about putting it into force, but it should be.
Sad reflections on the frailty of the parliamentary process.
A good call for must seek to further. Yes.
I think we confirmed the passage of the Act we did in getting climate law included. And then Alex referred to the relevance of that contextually to the litigation. My questions for Jolyon really is, when you were looking at the drafting of section 19A and proposing, your hooks, did you consider including the carbon budgets and the net zero targets in there? And if not, why not? Or do you think they were implicitly in there anyway?
I think certainly, I mean, what I had in mind was that there was a fairly narrow opening through which one might seek to slide. This was a very boring looking strengthening of a pre-existing duty, one that, as it were, Parliament had already swallowed. I guess I different people will have different assessments as to how you balance the simultaneous desires on the one hand to create measures that should terrify horses, and on the other hand to introduce those measures in ways that the horses are fairly content with. And I guess we structured it in the way in which we did because just because of where I sat on that assessment. I'm not, it's very easy to describe a perfect well, isn't it? But actually that doesn't achieve much. What you really have to do is try and bring that about, and that requires those sorts of assessments.
To come back to section 102. So what that says is a public authority must from time to time consider what action the authority can properly take consistent with the proper exercise of its functions to further the general biodiversity objective, which in the biodiversity objective is the conservation and enhancement of biodiversity. That's what your question was about, that provision.
It was about that provision, and it was the change of wording from section 74 of the Crow Act to section 41 of the NERC Act, which were broadly consistent in saying that it was embedded in the exercise of every function, to the change to that, which seems to be saying, well, from time to time, we need to think about this. And I read that as a weakening of the provision rather than the strengthening of the provision, even though it's presented as a strengthening of the provision.
All right. Well, I mean, I can't give a very sophisticated answer to that without thinking about it more. But I mean, this is again consistent with what we see in section 19 was the one thought I had, which is this continuation of the idea that a better environment is achieved through largely process type duties. So partly what this discussion is touching on is that it's very rare in legislation to actually require public bodies or private bodies for that matter to actually achieve anything. What they're always required to do in environmental law is to consult, get the public's opinion, make information available, and go through various processes to ensure that the environmental impacts are understood. I'm not an academic. I don't really know whether that's regarded as having worked, but it is the mainstream of environmental law globally and certainly at EU level. And I think, part of this discussion is groping for something a bit more substantive and saying, well, that's, we've done a lot of process. Now it's time to actually achieve some outcomes. Maybe that's what people are sort of working towards.
It's quite interesting to see that in its historical context. Obviously, you were talking about the Human Rights Act. Now, I remember the Human Rights Act coming out because I was in sixth form. And actually, the 25 odd years since has seen a change in how it's treated. But the Human Rights Act itself, of course, sits in a history line that's running back to particularly the Second World War, but actually prior to that as well, that led to these declarations. The environmental movement and the seeking to enshrine rights is relatively speaking more recent. We've talked about the Rio Declaration. You could perhaps take it back to Brundtland a little bit before that, but in that sector, actually, it's relatively new. So you can see how developments like this could, in due course, lead to duties more like you were discussing under the Protected Landscapes Act as it moves forward. I don't know what the panel feel about that.
Even when the Environment Bill was being debated, because it was so wide-ranging, people took the opportunity to test the waters, if you like. So they weren't real amendments that parliamentarians thought would get through. So, for example, the concept of ecocide had an early parliamentary outing. I think enshrining rights for environmental entities still feels quite a long stretch for this government in the current context. Other jurisdictions are exploring it a little bit more actively. But I think for me, the biggest rights issue we have is one, Aarhus, because we're still not in compliance. And when is the government going to bring us back into compliance, and what's needed to undertake there? And then actually those rights, which aren't environmental rights, but the ones in relation to things like protest, which do then impact on people seeking to exercise democratic rights about environmental protection. But that's a whole nother subject.
Yeah, and I guess I'd say, the point about the relative recency of concern about global heating does need to be seen in the context that Sasha outlines, and the fact that it's not really something that we can leave for a century to mature is true as well, but doesn't alter the very slow process by reference to which the law moves, and that does then in turn oblige you to look at other modes of legal protection. So you can talk about environmental protest, and there we're going backwards quite fast, I'd say. A more productive avenue to explore, if that's how you're thinking, probably is in environmental disinformation. So there are provisions in the Digital Markets Act, it's called something like that, about misleading advertising, which I think bear quite close examination. They make it a criminal offence to advertise a product in a manner that's misleading, and misleading is a statutory definition. That statutory definition is quite broad, and so I think to those in the room who are asking the question, well, if the process that we've been talking about this evening isn't going to get us to where we want to be quick enough, what other legal tools are there in the toolbox? That those measures probably are worth looking at more closely.
Well, if I take all the remaining questions and then let the panel answer those that we choose, and then we can move through to drinks. So yes.
Alex, just on the community action counts, I think again, as Ruth was saying, so there's a lot of sort of bringing of hands during the passage of environmental over the scope of the application of the duty. And what's really interesting in your case is that each time something went right and then went wrong, you still managed to find a way to rely on Section 19 because the Secretary of State has stepped in. And in a way, I think your case almost sort of suggests that that limited scope may not be quite as problematic as we first thought, which is really interesting, because even when you'd won and the Secretary of State stepped back in to undo all the good work you'd achieved in front of Natalie Leven, the Secretary of State stepping in offered a new target by making policy. So in a funny sort of back to front way, I wonder whether your case actually perhaps suggests that the scope point isn't going to be as damaging as we first thought. That's one point.
No, if I take them all and then we can just go along there. Was there one over here?
I mean, my second point.
Sure.
Right, so sorry. Which is, what if anything do we read into the decision, the new government's decision to continue to defend? I'm thinking of both Bank and Capital and all that stuff. The new government just gone, look, we're not going there, we're not doing this. But yeah, what if anything do we read?
Yes.
Right in the corner. It's primarily, I think, for Ruth, just about the OB. And you mentioned that the budget is ring fenced, Ruth. I'm assuming that means it can't go down, but it could go up. I hope it does. I'm just wondering whether you feel that it's kind of fit for purpose in the sense of the budget and the use of the powers. You mentioned that it hasn't used the full extent of its powers yet. And obviously it's early in the day and we haven't got to the point where environmental review is on the cards. Hopefully it will be. Do you think there's anything else that they're not doing that they could be doing in terms of the powers that they've got?
And there was one online, but the iPad has just folded. Are there are there any others in the room? Otherwise, we'll go along. So should we start with Ruth, Alex, and then?
Yeah, so if you subscribe to the ENDS report, there's an interesting article today about this very subject. And I think around about a year ago, one environmental NGO suggested that the OEP was sort of, you know, a glorified NGO kind of thing. And that was wrong at the time. But 1 year on, they've kind of re-asked that question. And I think especially in the last 6 to 9 months, the OEP, at least in my view, has really started to hit its stride. It's been in the courts, the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal, seeking to clarify the law. It's not taken sides between the different parties, and it's on the side of environmental law, which is what we wanted it to be. Some success, and in fact, can be shown perhaps through Finch. And it's also, you know, holding government's feet to the fire on lack of environmental progress, and it's been quite outspoken, and it's been allowed to be quite outspoken. So that's all encouraging. I guess the two sort of riders I might attach to that, you started, Carol, by asking about funding. So that commitment for a ring-fenced budget was a commitment of the previous government. The new government has not yet signed itself up to that. Would it? It's about to undergo the spending review, but we've asked it directly to repeat that commitment, because that commitment, yes, it's about money, but actually it's about independence and discretionary ability to operate. So that would be one. I think the second is the OEP is doing an awful lot of good work. We're interested in what impact that work will have and what the government does and when it does it. And I think the acid test of that will be in the summer when the government produces this new environmental improvement plan. We've all given advice on that. The OEP has given very specific advice. So if that plan is not a plan of action and it remains a plan of intention, then that impact will not be the one that we want to see.
So just going back to Jake's question was, so this is the Rights Community Action is a case challenging a policy from the previous administration, and the question was, what does one make of the continued defence of the appeal? I suppose when you bring a bit of strategic litigation, you're acting on behalf of a client that wants to see a policy changed. What you're trying to do with bringing a case in the courts is to open up the possibility that it will be reconsidered. You can't usually force something to happen as lawyers, but you can force a reconsideration. So I've not been shown anything, and there isn't anything in evidence to suggest that any active reconsideration has gone on. I suppose there must be some process of reaffirming instructions to defend the appeal, but it doesn't seem as though there's been any active review of the policy in terms of substantively considering its whole. So I'm not sure that the premise of assuming that that process has gone on is necessarily right. It might be more of a default defence. I'm not in a position to say.
And then finally, any final remarks?
Yes, I think certainly the contact I've had with the Conservative government in tax policy when I was a tax ilk, and then with the Labour policy as an advisor to the Labour Party, is consistent with Alex's thesis that they probably just haven't thought about it. The Act that I mentioned is the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act of 2024, and it contains those provisions which are quite sharp-toothed actually, and might have quite important environmental impacts in the right sorts of cases.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. For those of us who are here in person, we have some drinks waiting outside, and thank you to everyone online as well for joining us. If I could ask you to give a final round of applause to our speakers.